For this piece, I was able to easily remove the existing finish using lacquer thinner and steel wool. I followed that up with sanding with 120 grit. If you want to see this process in detail and some really amazing tips, like how to remove finishes without chemical strippers, or how to sand those ornate areas by hand, check out another video on my YouTube channel where I did this exact stripping method on a maple piece. The video is how to bleached and brushed grain on any wood. Before I paint any piece with milk paint, I like to water pop the wood. This gives it a nice under texture, and I do this by spraying it with water and then coming back with a lint-free rag. What this does is actually open up the wood's fibers so I can come back with my wire brush and remove all of that soft wood and open up the grain. This is especially important on woods like walnut where the grain is tighter. So the first thing I did was measure out my casing, my milk paint. I have 211 grams here, which is equal to about 1 1/3 cup. For the first color that I'm doing, I'm going to add just raw umber. And it's gonna be 211 grams of milk paint to 5.77 grams of raw umber. And we'll measure this out. All right, there we go. So that's about the color. And so to create a wash, I'm actually gonna add double the water. And you usually wanna go by volume here, right? So I know I have 1 1/3 cup of dry milk paint. I'll do is I'll add some water in my milk paint. All right, so now that our first wash coat is completely dry, and as you can see, it went on super translucent, but it dries down pretty opaque, but it still has a lot of dark areas coming through, which is what I wanted. This next layer is not a wash, right? It's just the regular 1-to-1 ratio of water and milk paint. This one will give me some more texture. I am not going to do a resist between these two layers because this color is actually the same color as what's on it right now. It's just a darker shade, right? It has more of that raw umber pigment into it. So when I go to distress it, I don't really care for that, that chipped away between those two colors. I would rather have those two colors when it's distressed to kind of fade into each other and give you nice variation in depth in color. So to put on this coat, since it's just the regular 1-to-1 ratio, I'm actually, for the top, I'm going to use white China bristle brushes. These are kind of like chip brushes. They're really thick ones, except these are a lot more beefier, obviously, and bigger. So if you kind of look, I don't know if the camera can pick that up. This one for the smaller areas, and then this one like for the top. This can hold a lot of milk paint, and this is especially important because when you're putting milk paint layers over an existing milk paint layer like I'm doing now, it is going to suck the moisture out of your paint and out of your brush. So you're really going to have to be able to load that brush up so that you don't have a bunch of unnecessary, undesirable brush strokes, kind of those pulling marks, if you will, in those lines. I'm all about texture with the brush, but when it's a big flat area like on the top, that's definitely not what you want. And then for the smaller areas, of course, my wash brushes, right? These are natural hair, goat hair, squirrel. Some are synthetic, but they act just like a natural bristle, and they're very fluffy. They do hold a lot of paint, but most importantly, they're very soft, so they don't need a lot of brush strokes unless I want them to leave the brush strokes, and I'll do a special technique for it to do that. So let's get started. All right, so now I'm doing my third color. I just measured it out. It's 109 grams. We're just gonna do the raw umber, and then we're gonna kind of gray it a little bit more for this color right here, this gray color, our third color. So I added a gram of raw umber and a gram of black iron oxide for my 109 grams of milk paint. Again, these two colors don't have a hard time breaking down, so I like to mix these ones dry. I like to do about half of the water just to slake all the pigments. See all the black pigments on the side? Kind of breaking down once the water's added. Just adding a little bit at a time kind of helps break all of that down. Okay, so now we will let that sit. All right, so now that this coat has dried, I'm gonna add that third coat that we just mixed up. What I do wanna do for this layer though, is I do want to do the wax resist, because I do want there to be some of that chippiness between those two colors since they are different with that gray added. It'll look fabulous. So I have a couple candle waxes, different sizes. One is kind of softer than the other. This one's a little harder. This one is like a pure natural wax, so it doesn't fall apart. So I just kind of play with all three when I'm doing the wax resist. I kind of have an idea of what I want it to be, but at the same time I do want it to be very organic and not a lot of the same patterns and shapes as far as the chippiness. So I'll start on the drawer, that way you guys can see close up how I do it. All right, so I'm going to use my wax sticks first to start off with, and how I'm going to do this is I'm going to focus on the edges first, because that's where, right, it would naturally wear away. And sometimes I'll rub. Sometimes I'll kind of do this where I just scrape it off the edge, especially focus on the corners. Sometimes I'll roll it near the edge, especially on those detailed raised areas, right? I'll roll it on top. And you also have to kind of think of composition, right? Or anywhere around any handles, that's a great place to add this wax resist, because that's where it would naturally, right, start breaking away from being handled. So I'm going to actually show you another method. So what I do is I grab an old wax puck. This is Amy Howard's Light Antique Wax. This one's my grungy one that I used specifically for this, and then I have an old chip brush that's really matted and hard. It's perfect for this. So what I do is now I can kind of place it where I want it and it won't pull up my finish. I just kind of goop it. We don't offload though when we're doing the wax resist. And I'm just going to touch it to the surface. Hopefully the camera can pick up those wax pieces, and I'll just kind of pounce, drag. Now remember, where I'm putting the wax, this is where this creamy white is going to show through. I tend to not want to go in the very center. I kind of work my way from the outside in. All right, so we're mixing our last color for the buffet, and I just mixed it. This one is 239 grams of milk paint to 5.9 grams of raw umber and 1.79 grams of black. So this is obviously our darkest color with that amount of pigment. Also, what you should note is I'm using this casing paint, and this recipe is different from the ones that we were using previously with the clay and the calcium carbonate. So this one is actually going to be plaster of Paris, hydrated lime, and casein. And there's going to be a big difference in texture and how thick it is, and you'll see that once we paint this on, but there's also going to be a difference in the way that I mix it. So since this is a thicker consistency and I'm mixing double the amount, I always double it up because it is thicker. So it doesn't go as far as square footage. So I'll use my blender stick for that. So we'll add some water, and then we'll start mixing it up. The blender wand does create foam, if you can see that. So what you can do is just take your blender wand and just hover it over the foam, and it'll actually break it all up for you. So we'll let this rest just like we do with the other milk paint. I'm going to let this rest overnight. We'll paint this last layer on. All right, so I'm super excited. We're on the very last coat of paint for this piece. I am going to do the wax resist. So I'm going to use the candlestick. I'm going to try to stay away from the brush and puck wax because I want these areas to kind of be a little bigger as far as like the chunkiness and the breakaway between the colors. So I'll go ahead and I'll start on the sides and then I'll work my way in the middle and then we'll put on our coat of paint. And if you notice that your brush is drying out fast, remember, just get it a little wet, dip it in some water. Just the tips. See how much smoother now it brushes out? Okay, so I just finished putting on this last coat of paint. Obviously, this looks really bad right now because part of it is drying down and getting lighter, and then all of the wet areas are still darker. But what I wanted to show you before it dries is the texture. So do you see the difference in this milk paint recipe? All of that incredible texture, especially where we kind of knocked our brush back and forth. It's not like a heavy brush stroke, like if you were to use like a chip brush, but the texture when it dries, it's just incredible. You can't mimic it with any other paint. And honestly, I've tried to get this kind of texture with the other milk paint recipes and brands, and you just can't do it. So so now that it's all dry, and I let this dry for 2 days, and I already started distressing the top just to kind of see what I wanted to do for the rest of it, and I kind of done a combination of the distressing techniques that I like to use for this one. Remember, we did use the wax resist on this, so I'm definitely going to be using my razor blade, and I start off by just gently scraping at the layers, and what this does is it helps to expose that wax that's buried underneath of the milk paint layers, and you can even use the tips to kind of dislodge the wax in the chunks. And then I follow up, and I only do this on the flat areas obviously, and then we're also going to need 4/0 steel wool. You're going to need a lot of them for a piece this big, so I grab a whole pack. And then of course our wire brush, and I have 2 here. And the reason I have 2 is because if you notice, the teeth are different distances apart, so that's going to give me a different pattern when I kind of knock at the paint to create that chipped away looks, and I'll give you a close-up of that. So I have one where the teeth are super close together, but they're small, and then these are larger and they're farther apart. Of course, you're going to need a brush to brush away that dried milk paint powder as you work. And then I have a water mister, and the reason I do that is because when you distress milk paint, it's very dry, the powder's in the air, you don't want to breathe that in, so I do recommend wearing a mask. But I can also kind of spray randomly the area that I'm distressing with water beforehand, then go in with my steel wool, and what that does is it brings the powder down, that's going out into the air, and it also kind of takes it away in a different pattern than it would if I were to just do the dry distress with the steel wool. So I'll show you that too. So let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to start on this drawer front right here first. And because of these recessed areas, I'm not going to use my razor blade on the entire thing. I will kind of use it to dislodge any wax that is on the corners if my steel wool is not working. And I'm just going to take my steel wool and I'm just going to go in circular motions. I'll start off on the edges first. Remember, you always start off on the edges and kind of work your way towards the middle. And I only work at a section at a time, so I would never do this whole drawer at the same time. I just want to work in sections. That way I can kind of see if the composition of the distressed area is working, if any areas are too heavy, if it needs to be balanced out. Maybe it's really heavy over here and it's not balanced on the other end. And I can work my way that way. See that powder in the air. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a little spray. And I'm not looking for 100% with it being wet. I'm looking for about 80%. I do want some dry areas. Just gently. There's not a lot of pressure that I'm doing with the steel wool. And these little marks you're seeing, that's where I did the wax resist. Those different little patterns that you wouldn't get unless you did that. And when I do these edges, I don't like to go like this because I feel like it gives it a very fake, distressed look. I like to go against it. So not parallel, but almost like a circular motion, but also pulling down so that I get different marks. So like this. On the edges. You see that? How it kind of breaks it off. And I just want to distress it about 50% right now with this. I will go ahead and add just a couple knocks. I like to kind of focus it on the edges. Around the handles. Any corners. This is really good for any areas like that, you know, it's not very distressed, but it just needs something. It doesn't need a whole lot taken off because we're trying to balance it out. And then I come back with my steel wool again and just soften it all out. To make the white antiquing spray, you'll need your spray bottle, 8 ounces water. Now to give this that white tint, we're going to add 1 tablespoon calcium carbonate. And 1 tablespoon of a white tint, and that can be white powdered pigments, like this titanium white. It can be a white universal tint, or it can even be a white pigment suspended in a liquid form like Faux Effects Faux Color White. And then we're going to add 8 ounces alcohol, just like the tea antiquing spray. All right, now that this piece is completely distressed, now we're going to add some antiquing to the milk paint. And just like I showed you how to mix, I'm going to use the tea and alcohol for the darker antiquing. And then over that, I will do the white antiquing. So it leaves a really lovely patina that that looks a lot like the Gustavian pieces. And you'll see that all come together after we spray this. Just going around the edges, running the edge of my brush.